Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into a case many of you have been asking about, Eugene Britt. Now, that name might not ring a bell right away, but you've sent in a ton of material, news articles, court documents, the whole works. And clearly, there's a desire to understand how this seemingly ordinary guy ended up committing such horrific acts.
It's interesting you say seemingly ordinary because that's one of the things that really stood out to me in these sources, too. It's like he flew under the radar for so long.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm hoping we can uncover today. How do all these seemingly unconnected events, all these little details that maybe got overlooked, how do they add up to this, well, this really terrifying bigger picture? And maybe even more importantly, can we figure out if any of it could have been prevented?
Well, like with so many cases like this, you got to start at the beginning. You got to go back to his childhood. Britt grew up in Gary, Indiana, extreme poverty. And the sources, they don't hold back. They paint a really grim picture of what his home life was like. His parents were alcoholics, his father especially, incredibly abusive towards his mother.
I wanted to ask you about that because you've also provided some research on adverse childhood experiences, those traumatic events, the ones that can have such a lasting impact on a person.
Yeah.
So looking back at Britt's early years through that lens, what are the things that jump out at you?
Well, one of the studies you sent, it talked about how witnessing domestic violence as a child, it can be just as traumatic as actually experiencing physical abuse yourself, right? And Britt, he was exposed to both. And that same study, it links these types of childhood trauma directly to a much higher risk of ending up involved in crime later in life.
And there's another layer here, right? The sources you sent, they all mention that Britt showed signs of an intellectual disability from a very young age.
Mhm.
So how do you think that played into everything? How did that interact with the trauma he was going through?
Oh, that's where things get really, really complicated. See, having an intellectual disability, it can make it that much harder for a child to process trauma, to cope with it in a healthy way. They might not have the same cognitive skills to understand what's happening to them or to tell someone how much they're hurting. And all that can lead to, well, this buildup of anger, resentment, this feeling of being powerless. And those are definitely things that can contribute to someone acting out in really destructive ways.
So it sounds like those early years, I mean, it was like a perfect storm, wasn't it? All these risk factors coming together. And it's almost no surprise then that when he was just 14 years old, Britt ran away from home.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big moment that the legal documents really zero in on. His lawyers, they argue that being out on the streets at that age without any support, any guidance, it's like that sealed his fate. And just a few years later, he commits his first major crime, 1978, the robbery and rape of a teenager.
Right, and that crime, it landed him a 30-year sentence. But the documents also show that he was paroled after serving only 15 years. What do you make of that decision? Looking back, do you think it was a mistake to let him out early?
It's tough to say for sure, but if we're talking about trying to stop future crimes from happening, yeah, it definitely raises some big questions. You sent over some research on recidivism rates, how often people who've been in prison end up committing crimes again, and it suggests that those rates are way higher for people who get released early,
Hmm.
especially for violent offenses.
In Britt's case, this early release, well, it set the stage for the really horrific crimes that would ultimately define his life. He goes back to Gary in 1993. And on the surface, it seems like he's trying to get back on track. He's living with one of his sisters. He's trying to hold down jobs. He's keeping a low profile.
But underneath all that, something dark was happening. You can see it in the sources you've shared. This picture starts to emerge of a man who's haunted by his past, struggling to cope with all those demons. And ultimately, he just gives in to this, well, this terrifying urge to kill.
And that brings us to May 1995, when Britt's killing spree begins. You've highlighted some news articles that really break down his victims, at least 7 that they could confirm, but possibly as many as 10. And their ages, they were all over the place, 8 years old to 51, all different backgrounds. One detail that really stuck with me was that one of his victims was a prostitute.
Yeah, that's a detail that really makes you think, doesn't it? Because it could point to a pattern of him targeting people who were vulnerable. Prostitutes, especially in a place like Gary, they're often on the margins of society. They're easier targets for someone like Britt.
And then there's the way he did it. It was the same every time. He'd attack from behind, drag them to some secluded spot, then he'd rape and strangle them. I mean, that level of planning, it suggests a terrifying amount of control, doesn't it? And just a complete lack of empathy.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some random out-of-control violence. There's a clear pattern here, a real calculated brutality, and that's deeply unsettling.
And this pattern, It went on until the case that would finally bring him down. The murder of 8-year-old Sarah Lynn Paulson. When she disappeared, I mean, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. And the police, they made finding her their top priority.
You know, her case is a perfect example of how the smallest details can be so important. The sources mentioned that they found fibers on Sarah's clothing, and those fibers, they matched the uniforms that employees wore at the Hardee's where Britt worked.
Wait, so a fast food uniform was his undoing. That's wild.
It does seem like a lucky break, right? But it also shows how thorough the investigators were. They didn't dismiss anything. And it was that attention to detail that cracked the case wide open. Plus, they found out that Britt had been seen riding his bicycle near where Sarah disappeared on that same day, so they knew he was in the area.
So they had the evidence. They placed him at the scene. How did Britt react when they finally brought him in for questioning? Did he confess right away?
Well, that's where things get a little unexpected. You highlighted a report about his interrogation, and it's really fascinating. At first, he denied everything, but the sources also revealed that his pastor, he actually played a huge role in the case.
His pastor. Now that's a new twist. How did he end up in the middle of a murder investigation?
It seems like the pastor and Britt, they had a really strong relationship. And he basically appealed to Britt's conscience. He begged him to confess. And it was during this really long interrogation, like 8 hours with the pastor there in the room, that Britt finally broke down. He admitted to killing Sarah.
Okay, so he confesses to Sarah's murder. But there's more, isn't there? The documents you shared, they mentioned that Britt didn't just stop there. He actually claimed to have killed a total of 10 people.
Yeah, and that's where this deep dive, it goes from a single murder investigation to something way bigger. We're in serial killer territory now. And what's even crazier, he actually led the police to a bunch of different spots where he said he'd gotten rid of the bodies.
So he confesses to all these murders. But we also know that the police could only link him to 7 victims, for sure. What about the others? The ones he claimed to have killed? Why were they never identified?
That's one of the biggest mysteries of this whole case. Even after all the searching, all the investigating based on what Britt told them, those other victims, they're still out there somewhere.
It's a horrible thought, isn't it? That there could be families out there who still don't know what happened to their loved ones, and it's all because of this one man. But let's go back to that confession for a second. The reports mention that Britt said he heard voices that told him to kill. Do you think that points to some kind of mental illness that might have played a role in all of this?
Well, it's definitely something you have to consider. And it adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated case, doesn't it?
And there's one more piece here that I just can't quite figure out. The incident where Britt got hit by a train right before they arrested him. Some reports say he was trying to kill himself.
Yeah, you're right. And according to that psychiatric evaluation you sent over, Britt himself said it was intentional. He said he'd been planning to end his own life. And you have to wonder, what was going through his mind? Was it guilt? Was he trying to escape what he'd done?
Or maybe it was a little of both. It's hard to know for sure. But what is clear is that Eugene Britt was a very troubled man, driven by forces that maybe even he didn't understand. But in the end, he did face justice, right? At least for some of his crimes.
That's right. The first trial was in Porter County for the murder of Sarah Paulson. And to avoid the death penalty, he made a deal. He pleaded guilty. And the sentence was life in prison plus 100 years.
So he avoided the death penalty for that one. But what about the other murders? Did those go to trial too?
They did. But the whole thing was really complicated by the question of his intellectual disability. His lawyers, they argued that because his mental capacity was diminished, his sentence should be less harsh.
Man, this case, it brings up so many issues, doesn't it?
Mm.
Accountability, the justice system, how we deal with mental illness. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And I think it's important to remember that even with a conviction, even with a sentence, there are still so many questions. Like those other victims who were never identified. And the role his mental health played in everything he did. There are things we may never know for sure.
That's a chilling thought. Okay, so before we go any further, let's just pause for a second and recap what we've learned about Eugene Britt so far.
We've seen how all that trauma from his childhood, mixed with his intellectual disability, it all created this foundation for the problems he had later on. We followed his path from runaway teenager to convicted rapist, 15 years in prison, then parole.
We talked about how those murders were all carried out in the same very disturbing way, how his pastor was the one who finally got him to confess, And we talked about the really complex legal issues around his trials and his sentences.
And we touched on those unanswered questions, like the unidentified victims and how big of a role his mental health played in his actions.
But I think the biggest question, the one that keeps coming back to me, is could any of this have been prevented? We're going to dig into that question even more in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at potential points where things might have gone differently, so stick with us.
So we've laid out like the whole timeline of Eugene Britt's life, right? All the way up to those horrific crimes. But now we got to deal with that question you keep bringing up. Could any of this have been stopped?
Exactly. We see how his past, how all that shaped him, but I keep thinking, were there points along the way where things could have gone differently? I mean, where do we even start with that?
Well, you sent over some research on like intervention strategies, right? Things that can help people who are at risk of ending up in trouble. Maybe we can use those to kind of guide us. Look at different points in Britt's life. And the first one, obviously, is his childhood. We know about the poverty, the abuse, his intellectual disability. Do any of the sources, do they give us any clues about how those things could have been addressed?
Well, there's this one study you included, and it focuses on early childhood intervention programs.
Yeah.
And it really stresses how important it is to identify kids with intellectual disabilities and support them, as early as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, early intervention, it can give those kids the tools they need to learn, to communicate, to figure out healthy ways of coping with things. It's like it's giving them a chance to really thrive, even with the challenges they're facing.
And this study, it also says that these programs, they're even more effective when they involve the whole family. Dealing with the issues that are going on, like poverty or substance abuse, it can create a more stable home environment, a more supportive one.
Exactly. It's about breaking that cycle,
Yeah.
the cycle of dysfunction, giving these kids a fighting chance. But with Britt, it seems like those opportunities, they just never came along. He runs away at 14, and that's where we hit our next possible point of intervention.
Yeah, and you shared some really heartbreaking stories, accounts from people who were runaways themselves, living on the streets of Gary during that same time. And they talk about this world of just desperation, crime, exploitation.
It really makes you realize, for a kid like Britt, especially one who was so vulnerable, the streets were a dangerous place. There was no one to protect him, and it's not a shock that he ended up in a life of crime.
So what could have been done differently back then? What kinds of interventions might have helped someone like him?
Well, there are resources out there for kids who run away, for homeless youth, shelters, counseling, job training. But the problem is, a lot of times, those resources are stretched thin. They don't have enough funding. They're overwhelmed.
And even when those resources are there, it's not always easy, is it? Convincing these kids that they need help, getting them to accept it.
No, not at all. You're dealing with kids who've been through a lot. They don't trust easily. They're carrying around all this trauma. And a lot of times, they're ashamed of what's happened to them. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of patience to get through to them.
But we can't give up on them, can we? We can't just write them off as lost causes.
No way. We have to do better. We need to put more resources into prevention, create a support system that catches these kids before they fall through the cracks.
Okay, so let's jump ahead now. 1978, Britt's convicted of robbery and rape, gets a 30-year sentence. But we know he only served half of that before he was paroled. You highlighted some research on, recidivism rates, the factors that make someone more likely to reoffend. What can we learn from that research? How does it apply to Britt's case?
Well, the research is pretty clear about one thing. The longer someone's in prison, the less likely they are to commit crimes again after they're released. But it's not just about how much time they serve. It's also about the rehabilitation programs they have access to while they're inside. Those programs, they make a big difference.
So you're saying just locking people up without dealing with the reasons they ended up there in the first place? That's not a real solution.
Nope, not at all. The focus needs to be on rehabilitation, on giving them the tools to change. Education, job training, counseling. Help them build a better life for themselves once they're out.
And with Britt, it doesn't seem like those programs were really there for him, did they? The sources, they mentioned that he really struggled to find a decent job after he got out. He kept bouncing around from one low-paying job to another.
Yeah, that's something ex-offenders face all the time. People judge them. They have a hard time finding work. There aren't many opportunities. And without a strong support system, without a clear path forward, it's really hard to break away from those old patterns. It's easy to fall back into the life you knew before.
And for someone like Britt, who was already dealing with so much, the trauma, his disability, those challenges must have felt impossible to overcome.
Absolutely. We need a system that doesn't just punish, you know? It needs to give people a real chance to turn their lives around, to redeem themselves.
That brings us to the whole question of mental health. Throughout these sources, there are hints that Britt was really struggling mentally. He talked about hearing voices. He tried to kill himself. Do you think those could have been warning signs? Signs that people miss? What could have been done differently?
Well, one of the reports you sent, it goes into detail about how bad the mental health services were in the Indiana prison system back then. The system was totally overloaded, not enough staff, and they just weren't equipped to deal with the kinds of complex needs that someone like Britt had.
So even though he was in the system, he wasn't getting the help he needed.
It sure seems that way. And even after he was released, there's nothing to indicate that he got any kind of mental health treatment, no follow-up care at all.
It's almost like everyone was so focused on his past crimes that they missed what was happening inside him, this storm that was brewing.
That happens a lot, unfortunately. We tend to think of mental illness and criminal behavior as two totally separate things. But so often, they're connected. They feed into each other. We need to look at the whole picture, understand how mental health, trauma, and criminal behavior all interact.
Sounds like you're talking about a complete overhaul of the system, not just a few small changes.
Yeah, you're right. We got to rethink the whole approach to crime and punishment. It can't just be about punishment. It needs to be about rehabilitation, about healing, about stopping these tragedies from happening in the first place.
That's a huge challenge. But it's got to be worth it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Britt's case, the violence, it escalated to this horrifying level.
Yeah.
We need to try and understand what was going on in his mind.
Yeah.
What drove him to kill?
Exactly. We've talked about his MO, how all the attacks were so similar, how he chose vulnerable victims. But to really get to the bottom of it, we need to understand the psychology behind it all. You sent over some research on the psychology of serial killers, right? What are some of the key takeaways there? Anything that might help us understand, Britt?
There's this one study that talks about compartmentalization. Basically, it's this ability to separate different parts of your life, different parts of your mind. It says that some serial killers, they can put on this mask of normalcy while they're also doing these horrible things.
And that seems to fit with what we know about Britt, right? He was able to hold down jobs, interact with his family, blend in. But at the same time, he had these dark urges he was hiding, and he was committing these brutal murders.
It's like he built a wall in his mind, didn't he? Separating those two worlds. It's a really scary thought.
It is, and it makes you wonder about the nature of evil, you know? Was Britt born this way, or was it his experiences that made him who he was? Was he a monster, or was he a victim of his environment?
Those are tough questions, and there are no easy answers. But I think the research is pretty clear about one thing. It's rarely just nature or just nurture. It's usually a mix of both. You've got genetics, you've got your environment, and then you've got the choices you make. All those things come together.
I agree. And in Britt's case, you can see how all those factors collided. The rough childhood, the disability, the way the justice system treated him, his mental health issues, it all added up to this darkness that just consumed him.
It's a reminder that even the worst things, even the most horrific acts, they usually have a long and complicated history. But understanding that history, understanding the choices that were made, the missed opportunities, that might be how we prevent these tragedies from happening again.
Yeah, I think you're right. By studying cases like Eugene Britt's, we can learn so much about what leads to violence. And hopefully we can use that knowledge to find better ways to intervene, to prevent these things, to help people change.
It's like this journey, isn't it, of exploration and discovery. And we have to approach it with open minds, with compassion, and with this commitment to creating a world that's safer and more just for everyone. Okay, so I know you've been wanting to talk about some of the more disturbing details that came out in Britt's confession.
Yeah, there are some things about his crimes that are especially hard to stomach, you know. Details that show just how deep his depravity went. And I think it's important that we talk about them, that we confront that darkness head on, even if it's tough to hear.
You're right. We can't shy away from the truth, no matter how hard it is to face. So let's do it. Let's explore those disturbing details. Let's see what we can learn by looking into the darkest parts of Eugene Britt's mind. We've been through a lot with this deep dive into Eugene Britt's life. I mean, it's heavy stuff, right? But I get the sense that you didn't send in all this research just so we could rehash the past. You're looking for something more. Am I right? What do you hope to gain from all of this?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? What can we actually learn from a case as awful as this? It's easy to get stuck on the horror of it all, but there's got to be a deeper meaning here, right? You've included all these articles, these reports on things like reforming the criminal justice system, social work, even some philosophical stuff about what evil really is. It seems like you're trying to figure out how to prevent these kinds of things from happening again.
Yeah, you're spot on. And throughout our conversations, there have been these themes that keep popping up, like how childhood trauma plays a role, the ways the justice system fails, the lack of mental health resources. It's all connected, isn't it?
It totally is. And this goes way beyond Eugene Britt. His case, it just highlights these big problems that affect so many people. You included a study about the cycle of violence, how trauma gets passed down through generations, and how that impacts communities for years and years.
Yeah, that study really got to me. It talks about how intervening early, that's the key to breaking that cycle. And you also pointed out programs that focus on helping families who are struggling, giving them resources. Things like parenting classes, affordable childcare, treatment for substance abuse.
Those programs are so important because they get at the root of the problem. If you strengthen families and communities, you create an environment where violence is less likely to happen. But early intervention, that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? We've got to look at the justice system itself.
Exactly. We saw how Britt fell through the cracks, how letting him out early after serving only half his sentence, well, that might have been a huge missed opportunity. And you sent over some really strong arguments for changing the way our justice system works. So what are some of the big changes that you think would actually make a difference?
Well, one report you sent focused on something called restorative justice. The idea is to repair the harm that was done by a crime, instead of just focusing on punishing the person who did it. It involves bringing everyone together, the victims, the offenders, even people from the community, to find solutions that help everyone heal and that hold the offender accountable.
That's a pretty different way of thinking about things, isn't it? It's a big change from that lock them up and throw away the key mentality. Do you really think something like that could have worked for someone like Eugene Britt?
I mean, it's impossible to say for sure, right? But it's definitely worth thinking about. Remember, his first serious crime was that robbery and rape. What if, instead of just sending him to prison, they'd tried to get to the root of his problems, helped him understand the pain he caused, helped him make things right with the victim?
It's an interesting idea, and it brings up another one of those recurring themes, mental health. As we've gone through this deep dive, it's obvious that Britt's mental state was getting worse and worse, but there's hardly any sign that he got the treatment he needed. You included articles about how messed up mental health care is, especially for people who are in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and it's a huge problem. We can't keep ignoring it. We need to put more resources into mental health services, both in prisons and in our communities. We need to train police officers how to recognize mental illness, how to calm things down without using force.
And we need to make sure that anyone who's struggling with their mental health can get help. It shouldn't matter if they have a criminal record or not. We need to create a system that helps people heal and get better, not one that just keeps those cycles of trauma and violence going.
You also sent some research on the neuroscience of empathy, like how it actually can be learned and developed. There are these programs out there that use mindfulness and other things to help people become more empathetic and compassionate.
That's amazing. So even though someone like Eugene Britt did these terrible, horrible things, there's still a chance for them to change.
I believe so. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it gives us some hope. It shows that even the darkest parts of a person can be touched by compassion. And it reminds us that we all have a responsibility to try to create a world where things like this are less likely to happen.
That's a powerful message, and I hope everyone listening really takes it to heart. Eugene Britt's story, it's a tragedy, but it can also be a wake-up call. It reminds us that we're all connected, that our actions have an impact on others, and that we have a duty to make the world a better place for everyone, a place where people feel safe and valued. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep working to make the world a better place.